Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Radio Renaissance. This is Paul Kersey. This week, Mr. Taylor is not available, but in his place, we have the absolutely esteemed, and we are honored to have Mr. Sam Dixon. Sam, how are you this afternoon, sir?
I'm fine. I'm honored to be here. I don't think I'm very esteemed, but I'm happy to be here.
Well, you are esteemed, and again, it's always a pleasure to speak to someone who is the last speaker. It's one of the great traditions of American Renaissance. And just shameless plug, sir, to start this podcast. We are less than about, I think, 50 days to the next conference in right outside of Nashville in Tennessee. And there's still some availability. I know you're going to be giving the last speech at that event, the last presentation. But what can you tell those who might be hesitant about making that pilgrimage to Tennessee for this event? What can you tell them they'll get the opportunity to be a part of this conference?
Well, it's like a fire. You take one coal out of the fire with the tongs and set it to one side, and the coal dies. To make a fire, you need to have other coals, and you draw inspiration, and you network, and your spirits are revived. One psychology is very, very important. I think we often people like on our side often don't give proper value to things that people the New Age movement does give value to. Personal esteem, how you regard yourself, and we like to think we're so tough that we don't need encouragement, but we do need encouragement, and our morale is very important, and our mental health is very important, and I've said before that American Renaissance is like a psychiatrist. We're putting people in touch with their feelings. And so I think it's very important to come and that we have these meetings and that they be well attended. And I think people will enjoy it and they will get a lot out of it.
So listeners, if you have any questions about how to sign up, go ahead and shoot it over to me because we live here at protonmail.com. Once again, that email address is because we live here at protonmail.com. Now, Sam, there's a lot going on across the country. It's been absolutely shocking to see a lot of the things that have happened over the past couple of weeks, especially since the assassination of Charlie Kirk. But one of the things that I believe is so important is walking back slowly a lot of the insanity that started about 5 years ago with the fentanyl death overdose of George Floyd. And something happened this week that I think you thought was very much worth talking about. And that's that the FBI agents have been fired after kneeling at the George Floyd protests in 2020. The FBI Agents Association, Sam, has called dismissals unlawful and urged Congress to investigate. FBI Director Kash Patel. Sam, do you remember this photo that we're going to talk about that emerged shortly after the George Floyd protests started nationwide?
Oh yes, it was given a lot of approving attention by the media. Actually, it's very important that the political police not not express or have any passionate attachments to one point of view. In Great Britain, the guards and stuff, the cops that cover things, the guards at the Royal Palace and so forth, they are not allowed. They are stony silent. I remember they came to a meeting of the British National Party that I spoke to, and we had to be hurried out of the meeting venue because their equivalent of Antifa had found out where we were meeting, and there were several thousand of them, and the violent ones. And so the police came in and said, "We'll help you get out of here, but you have to cooperate with us." The guy that was in charge of it, and he explained that they would have this line of cops to try to hold the Antifa back, and we could go like the children of Israel crossing the Red Sea. We could rush down this corridor they created and get into the subway station where they had a train there to take us out and several stops away and then let us out. We would be safe. But anyway, I thought I'd be polite. And as we hurried past these people, I would say to these British cops, thank you. They made absolutely no response. Yeah, and I think a lot of them probably were somewhat sympathetic to us. They didn't look like lunatics. They looked like real Englishmen and Scots, but they absolutely would not say one word.
Mhm.
And that's how it really should be. The FBI has always been a corrupt organization. I mean, I read stuff in the New York Times that's just laughable. When I was in college, the New Left were the ones that critiqued American history and denounced patriotism. Really, that should have been us, but that was the New Left. And they now are the most solemn Tories. They worship at the altar of the United States government, the intelligence agencies, and they just love wars. They love the Pentagon. They love the CIA. And the New York Times was carrying on about how Trump is corrupting the FBI, which has always been independent of political administration. This is just laughable. The FBI has always been under Hoover and after Hoover has always been, a police agency that served the incumbent president. Roosevelt, the FBI enthusiastically cooperated with Roosevelt in harassing and attacking and persecuting people who opposed Franklin Roosevelt. But so it's not new at all. But this business of kneeling, in a way, it was for George Floyd. That was probably good for us because one of the good things that's come down in recent years is that the solid majority of the founding stock, the British people of British extraction and the related peoples from other nations in Europe, in America, who had always worshipped at the altar of the FBI and watched movies like The Untouchables and things like that. I think the bloom is off that rose, and tens of millions of Americans like you and me and our listeners now know what the FBI is, and they know if they're on a jury not to believe the FBI agents. That you don't just assume, oh, he's with the FBI. He's like Robert Stack on the movie The Untouchables. This is going to be the straight skinny. No, the rebuttable presumption has to be that FBI agents are lying.
Yeah, the
Uh,
Elliot Ness myth is just that. It's just something good for Hollywood. Kevin
Yeah,
Costner role.
they're just terrible. People can't imagine how horrible the FBI is. They can't imagine what the courts are like in America. Including our esteemed friend and leader, Jared Taylor. He has a very optimistic, charitable view of the courts and law enforcement, and I respectfully disagree. The courts are just terrible. The judges are horrible, horrible. Their characters are horrible, and we cannot, you don't go, you do your best to stay out of court, stay
Yeah.
away from judges. No.
Well, in this case, the American people get to judge the fact that what we saw back in May, June of 2020, now there are consequences because, like you've been mentioning this whole time, the FBI fired nearly 24 agents who were photographed kneeling. A lot of them women, Sam, amid the George Floyd protests in 2020, according to reports. I'm not making any observation except for just pointing out that they were ladies. An estimated 20 agents, they've been dismissed. Reuters framed the number of fired agents as more than a dozen. The photographs at issue reportedly showed a group of agents taking a knee during one of the demonstrations in Washington, D.C. after the May 2020 killing of Floyd in Minneapolis. We also saw across the country police in solidarity take a knee with demonstrators. I'm sure you remember some of those photos, and I actually think I remember some coming from Atlanta and from Birmingham, Alabama, and some places in the South. But the FBI has declined to comment to Fox News when asked about the reported terminations. But the FBI Agents Association, Sam, they condemned the firings as unlawful, warning they violated civil service protections. Sam, I do want to ask you this. We weren't going to talk about this story.
Before you ask your question, there's something I wanted to say, and that is that to reiterate that the political police, which they are not supposed to indicate political preferences. They're not supposed to do this any more than they would come to some sort of ultra right wing meeting and give Nazi salutes with who was that guy, George Lincoln Rockwell. You don't do that. And the other part of the story, which you may not have seen, is that it's now been released that a lot of FBI agents after January 6th posted complaints with the agency about how left wing the agency had become, and that there was hardly even any pretense of impartiality. That the agency has simply become a left wing group.
Yeah.
That came out. You may have seen that a couple of days ago. That came out.
That's actually my question that I was going to ask you, because I know
I'm
one of the things that
sorry.
you've focused on over the years has been what happened on January 6th, and then of course the just unbelievable witch hunt utilizing every facet of technology, from Bank of America being more than helpful with the FBI investigations into people who use their credit card at at the metro or at a restaurant in DC to track them down and triangulate their position to go after them and get them imprisoned, and for what happened on J6. And now it turns out, Sam, that there were 275 plainclothes FBI officers, FBI agents at J6. What?
Well, and the January 6th committee, their official story was that there was no FBI involvement, and what was that
Correct.
guy? Epps was out there urging people to commit crimes. Most people did not commit crimes. Most people just stayed outside the Capitol and chanted slogans and stuff. But he was there. You saw him right there urging crimes, and he was never prosecuted. And you have to be a real dope. You have to be a completely airheaded, indoctrinated leftist not to think how odd this is. That there has to be a real reason why the guy that was screaming and yelling and trying to get people to attack the Capitol, why he was never prosecuted, while people who just walked in the Capitol were
Statutory all,
prosecuted
yeah.
and held in jail in very harsh conditions, for long periods of time. It makes no sense. Nobody running a police agency would have exempted Epps. He would have been at the top of the list. But the other thing about the January 6th, to sort of shift topics a second, it hasn't been commented on enough that after Trump won the election, the January 6th committee ordered that all of their records be shredded and destroyed. Did you see that?
I did not know that.
Yes. The theory that the leftist press, the system media put up was that, well, there might be things in there that would expose people to persecution by Trump. Well, that's nonsense. You're not supposed to have agencies of the government shredding and destroying records to begin with.
Correct.
Well, the other thing is, if that group, which was flawed from the inception, it was just a witch hunt. If that committee actually carried out a fair and impartial investigation and obeyed the rules, they should have wanted to preserve the record of all the good conduct of people like Liz Cheney. And it's again, you have to be a complete simp, a gullible dope, not to understand why they would destroy all the records, the very records that they will tell us would have shown how good they were, how virtuous, how they obeyed the rules. You know, it's just astonishing that this stuff is right in front of people in America, but most Americans don't notice, and the liberal leftist system media systematically suppresses it. Yeah, they talk about the assault on democracy.
Yeah.
Well, you look at that January 6th committee. But we have a 200 plus year old tradition in this country, which is that the opposition party is accorded seats on committees of Congress proportionate to the number of seats they have in the House of Representatives. Well, the Republicans had 45%, but they only got 2 out of 9 on that committee because Nancy Pelosi, she changed the rules. She decided there would be the Republicans. There should have been 4 Republicans and 5 Democrats. Instead, because she couldn't find Republicans who would play patty cake with her, enough of them, she cut them down to half of what our traditional system is, the fair tradition, the democratic tradition. And the tradition has been that the opposing party chooses committee assignments for its members. But she wouldn't do that. Pelosi took over that. She said that she would choose the Republicans, and she appointed this war munitions woman, This member of the grotesquely horrible Cheney family with the blood dripping off her hands of all the men that were
Lynn
killed,
Cheney. Yeah.
named in Iraq, so that she and her disgusting father could count their money. She has a legitimate reason to hate Trump. He denied her the war that she and Daddy Dick feel is their right. They have a right to make tens of millions and hundreds of millions of dollars off of the suffering of American servicemen. But anyway, talk about the tax on democracy. Right there, you have it. But you won't hear anything about it in the system media, and it's surprising how our own people don't talk about these things, like what you were talking about the FBI agents that we now find out were involved in this event on January
It's
6th.
a scandalous story. There's no doubt about that.
Unbelievable. It's just something unbelievable. And people don't see that we also often lose track of the obvious. People on our side get distracted by the red herrings, which is an old English term. I forget that modern people. I grew up in the world of the 19th century, a century before my parents were so old, and their parents so old. And I live in the 1700s, so I often use phrases like red herring. I don't realize that people don't know, but that was a way you distracted the attention of bloodhounds that were trying to trace something. But there's so many red herrings. In this, and George Floyd is a colossal red herring, even before you get to the issue, the so-called issue. Let's just assume for a moment, and everybody just turn off, stop contradicting and kicking against the pricks. But let's just assume it's all true that the cop Chauvin willfully, deliberately killed George Floyd, and that George Floyd was as pure as riven snow. He descended from the left hand of God as some kind of saint.
I
What
already
you
accepted that, Sam.
well, when you
I'm
just
just,
just accept what they say.
yeah.
When you boil it all down, one white guy killed one black guy. Is that news? How many white guys get killed by black guys? But it was turned into this huge thing for, billions of dollars of damages and people dying and riots and all this stuff. And the Congress having a moment of silence for George Floyd, whom we know was a disgrace to the black race. Thank God he wasn't a white man. He'd have to be embarrassed if he was a white man. But people bought into, oh, this is serious. We need to find out about the initial coroner's report that contradicted the story of the trial. Well, that's all nice and good, but the whole story was dead on arrival. And you look at the Kavanaugh hearing. There were reasons why grown-ups, why adults would question Kavanaugh's nomination to the Supreme Court. Kavanaugh was one of the lawyers who advised Bush II that it was okay to put American citizens on planes and ship them out of the country to other countries where we could rely on those countries to torture them. I would like to know more. If I'd been a senator on that panel, that's the kind of question I would like to ask him about, whether he was going to uphold the idea that American citizens could be taken out of the country for the purpose of torturing them. He says he felt that was constitutional in advising George Bush. Did he feel it was okay to waterboard prisoners and all this sort of thing? Like, we tried Germans for stuff like that, but now we embraced it under George II. But instead, it all became this thing that you couldn't make up anything sillier. The issue became, did he, when he was 17 years old and a junior in high school and drunk, did he make a distasteful attempt to have sex with a girl? That became, well, the whole thing should just be laughed at. What parent would want his son, who's now age 53, judged by what he did when he was a drunk, hormone raging, junior in high school? The whole thing is just silly. If the woman had had a video proving beyond the slightest doubt that her story was legitimate, and I'm aware, like our readers, our listeners, I know that the whole story is improbable and made up. But if it were true, no adult person, if you were going to have your lung cancer, if you had, going to have the tumor in your lung removed, would you give a damn about what your doctor had done when he was 17 years old as a drunk teenager?
Not at
It,
all.
it's just
No.
laughable. These things are
You
laughable.
did that too? It's probably what you'd say when you heard when you
Yeah.
started discussing
How
stories.
many of
Yeah.
us have done things when we were teenagers or college students and were drunk that we would not want our kids or wives or husbands or the general public to know about? It's ridiculous. But people and people lose sight of another thing, and that is one of your stories I think that you want to talk about was a story from Fayetteville, Georgia, Fayette County, about this hullabaloo about blackface, and the real the story about that incident, which we can discuss. Why don't you introduce it, and then we can discuss it and subject it to the same scrutiny as we did the George Floyd.
I will. I will. I just want to finish up the story because there's one thing that you said that's really important to point out about the putting a bow on the FBI story. The Washington Post, Sam, reported that Patel's allies have framed the kneeling incident as an evidence of, as you said, political bias in the ranks. Agents involved in the kneeling said they were caught between orders to avoid confrontation and the reality of facing angry crowds. This wasn't politics, it was survival, one former agent told Reuters. So it's really fascinating to think about what we saw, all the people taking a knee. There was a crazy story, Sam, out of Oklahoma State University. The football coach who just got fired, Mike Gundy, he was wearing a One American News Network shirt in June of 2020 and for an interview, and the left went nuts. And they basically got his team, a number of the black players on his team, to say, hey, that's a racist network. He had to apologize for it and say he'll do better and that he would potentially take sensitivity training. Not making this up. Like that's how insane America was in May, June, July, and henceforth from that moment. And we're still pretty insane as this Fayette County story is going to be, but it's been this way for a long time though, hasn't it?
It has, and I think that's one thing about the young folks. We made tremendous things are much better now. We made great progress. The young guys and the women are so much wiser than they were when I was a kid. But they have this delusion that the past was the way that the leftist media and the teachers and professors say it was. That in the 1950s, it was right wing and people were very racist. That's just not true. This stuff was all around us when I was a kid in the 50s and 60s. In elementary school, high school, college, it was as wildly left wing, and the textbooks were as biased, and the teachers as bigoted as they are now. It wasn't. I was captain of the school debating team when I was in high school. I've always liked to talk, and around 10th grade, we had a meeting of the debate team, and we drew things out of a hat, and gave extemporaneous speeches. And I drew out the Hungarian Revolution of 1956. So
Ooh.
I talked about that, and our faculty sponsor, our parent sponsor, was a woman in our neighborhood, and she came over to me when we wrote and said, "Well, Sam, I did want to talk to you about what you said. You've been misinformed." She said, I've been in Hungary, and Hungary is a paradise. There was no Hungarian Revolution. That was all made up by the capitalist press, and all you have is a few people, fascists, that created an incident. But she said it's just great, and I had sense enough at age 15 or 16 listening. So I thought, well, it's pretty clear this woman's a communist. But that's how people were back then, and people have just no idea. The Grand Duchess Olga, the Tsar's sister, was invited to be the honorary chairman of a charity ball that the White Russians, the ones that fought the Reds in the Civil War, would have every year in New York City to raise money for Russian refugees. And she lived in Canada, and the American government, I forget whether it was John Kennedy or Eisenhower, turned her back because they said we can't allow a member of the royal family to come to a charity ball to help Russian refugees, it would be an insult to the communist government of the Soviet Union. That was like 1959 or 61. That's what it was like.
I just was reading a book about Ole Miss and integration in 1962, which in a lot of ways, Sam, that makes what happened in Little Rock pale in comparison, because you had to send in massive amounts of the National Guard because there was a legitimate, I won't say revolution, but the students actually fought back in regards to the integration of the school. And there were a lot of famous bumper stickers, which you don't see that much anymore, but they basically called Oxford Kennedy's Hungry.
Well,
Which I found fascinating.
I remember the old people in my family, my uncles and my cousins of my grandmother commenting in '56. I was like, I think I was 9 years old, but almost simultaneously, you had the three crises, right along in that time period. You had the Hungarian Revolution, and the American government did not send so much as one single bullet to help the Hungarians, who were trying to free their country from the Soviet system and who actually expelled the Soviet troops with the help of the Hungarian army that mutinied for about a week.
Oh,
Hungary was a free country. And then the Soviets reinvaded. They pulled up more troops and invaded. We didn't give them so much as a round of ammunition. And you compare that today to the fact we've given 200 billion to Ukraine to fight against a non-communist government of Russia. And that tells you what Eisenhower was like. What the American State Department and the government was like, contrasting their pro-communist policies in '56 with their warmongering policies in 2023, 24, and 25.
exactly.
But that was one crisis, and we did absolutely nothing. And then you had the crisis at Central High in Arkansas, and Eisenhower swung into action and sent the troops in.
57. Yeah.
Yeah, and old people, when I was a kid, were commenting about that in South Carolina. They said he'll send the troops to Little Rock, but he won't send a round of ammunition to Budapest.
I hate
And
to laugh at that, but it
you know,
is
and then you had
true.
the British and French tried to stop the Arabs from confiscating the canal and the Suez Canal that belonged to the British and French who had built the damn thing. And Eisenhower called up the Prime Minister of Great Britain and is said to have cussed him out in barracks term language that he was to pull all the troops back and turn it over to the third world. So this is America. This stuff has deep taproots, and the roots go into a fundamental American sickness that we have to be aware of. You have to be aware of genetic problems. When I was a kid, my parents would remind me that we had alcoholics on both sides of the family, and they said, "We know you're going to drink. You go to college, but keep in mind you don't want to end up like these alcoholics." And I never forgot that. When I was in college, I would nurse a drink during the party, and I wouldn't get drunk because I did not want to be like that. But they were aware of the genetic imperfections in our family background, and we have I think genetic imperfections in our national character, because when you go back in time, you find this kind of stuff in the earliest days of our country. When the Pilgrims came to Plymouth Rock, I read a history of that called the Bay Colony by a very good historian named Philbrick, and he talked about the Pilgrims put Indians on juries to judge white people, and they
They were
put
already
them.
granting citizenship to aliens, is what you're saying.
Yeah, now this is like 1620, and they come here and they make these Stone Age Indians jurors, and in one case they put a guy to death for murdering an Indian in the woods. There were no witnesses, but the Indians said, "Oh no, Smoking Peace Pipe would not have done anything wrong," and so they went along with this. And you had the Mayflower Compact. When we talk about America, not how terrible the idea is that America is a proposition nation, and that's absolutely right. you cannot have a free country if it's a proposition country, and you can't have a mentally normal country if it's a proposition country. But this idea is not new. You read the Mayflower Compact, and it sounds like Bill Clinton. And so this stuff goes way deep into our history. It is not a recent aberration, and rooting it out is going to be a task that's going to require enormous effort and lots of time.
Well, I'll tell you what, speaking of rooting it out, we've got a situation not far from downtown Atlanta, Georgia, in Fayette County. This is just one of those funny stories because if you look at it immediately, you can dismiss it. But the more you realize the reasons you can't dismiss it is makes it actually kind of funny because even though the people who are complaining about it were wrong, they're still right because if you say they're wrong, you're still a racist. So the reason we're talking about this is you have the Fayette County. That's a very well, it's a county southwest of Atlanta. Uh,
Populated by pilots and people who work in the airlines.
Primarily, yeah. That's also where the studio actually is. You've got I forgot the name of it. It used to be called Pinewood Studio, but that's where a lot of the movies are made now, actually. But several Fayette County school parents and community members, they're outraged after a photo circulated online of 5 people at a Whitewater High School volleyball game. This was a couple weeks ago with their faces and bodies painted black. Uh-oh, you know what this means. Adrian Cooley spoke out along with others during the school board's meeting public comment period. Well, let me tell you, if you've never had a blackface incident at your child's school, you don't know the pain I felt when I saw that picture, Cooley said. Okay, so the superintendent apologized at the meeting. Families, though, are questioning how the group was allowed into the building in the first place and want to make sure this doesn't happen again. And why I'm laughing is going to become very clear shortly, ladies and gentlemen. The picture drew the attention of Democrat State Representative Derek Jackson and local NAACP leaders. I'm trying to figure out why in 2025 this is not entertainment. This is not cute. This is not fun. Why would someone in 2025 do this? Rep. Jackson said while holding up the photo purportedly of white people in blackface. Jackson and the NAACP leaders claim the picture is an example of blackface and it's causing pain for the families in Fayette County. Now, Fayette County, I want to say in 1990, Fayette County was, I think, 95% white. I believe now Fayetteville is majority black. The county it was the only metro county, Sam, I read, that actually voted for Trump in 2024. But it is seeing massive demographic change. Anyways, going back to a quote here, I got notice that said, oh, they had a blackout game. Well, blackout means simply just wearing black, not on your face, because that in itself is offensive, said Fayette County NAACP Vice President Quentin Pullen. So, Sam, buried within this article from WSB Atlanta, the ABC affiliate, they finally let out the truth of this entire story. It was a blackout game. That means for our listeners who might be from across the Atlantic in Europe, a blackout game is when you have a team that has black as a primary color of their uniform. The entire stand, the entire audience coming to cheer them on wears black, just as the team is doing. And guess what? A couple of white people decided to paint themselves the team color, black. Yet this was misidentified as blackface. But as the black individuals who got mad about this realized, never let a crisis go to waste, Sam, and they decided to cry racism and to get attention brought to this. During a public comment, a man read a statement on behalf of the people in the picture. He said it was a blackout theme game, and they were there to support a Whitewater player whose name they spelled out on their chests. So again, there was no racial intent behind the actions. As soon as those involved came out, administration asked them to remove it from their faces, and they did so willingly. They apologized to anyone that was offended. I mean, again, it's pretty laughable, actually. But I'm sure
The whole thing is laughable. And here again, you really, the first step should be to not take it at face value. Let's assume that three or four kids put blackface on to make fun of black people. Well, this is a country with 335 million people in it. You know, this is hardly even news, and all these black people saying, "Oh, we're just devastated." You hear the same thing about Confederate statues now. It's very common to hear blacks. I hear black lawyers say this, that their whole lives were rendered difficult and all that because they had to walk by a Confederate soldier's statue going to elementary school. Well, this is so silly. You know perfectly well none of them gave a damn about it. And nor should you give a damn about it. Really, the such people should be told, well, have you ever sought professional help? We become so feminized in the worst sense, beyond the normal woman's desire for comforting and nurture. But people. And this is not a racial issue. It is a racial issue, but it's also a broader issue. You know, People talk about their parents. You have 50. I had a friend of mine in his 60s who had a beautiful wife, a house in Buckhead, our richest neighborhood in Atlanta, and a successful business. And he started talking to me that his life had been ruined because his father didn't come and watch his soccer games when he
Mm.
was in high school 45 years before. I told him, I said, Mike, if I believed that, I would not tell anyone that because they would laugh at me.
Hold on
Yeah,
to that resentment. Yeah, I get what you're saying.
2-year-old saying something like that, but we hear this all the time in our society, and it's just we're living in an insane asylum, and it's just beyond belief. But going back to this story about the blackface, well, what about other stories? Are these black people upset about the Ukrainian woman getting her throat cut in Charlotte?
Iryna Zarutska. No, I
If you
doubt it. Sure,
That's
they're
right. The media was saying, "Oh, that's racist. That's racist." You can't talk about that. But you can bet these same blacks that are strutting around with the NAACP, there's no moral introspection. There's nothing like, well, we black people need to work on this. We're committing, 10 or 15 times the number of murders of white people, and we really need to do something about correcting our ways. There's none of that. And this white guy in his 20s that was sodomized to death in Alabama, I talked about before, in October of last year. He was gang raped for 2 days and hemorrhaged to death. That wasn't news. Mary Louise Kelly on National Public Radio, Anderson Cooper, they're all excited about George Floyd. But the fact that blacks did this to a white father of two who was 15 days from ending his sentence for burglaries and minor criminal thing, that's not news. They don't give a damn. And you know these stories now about what the NAACP is doing just show how utterly the civil rights program has failed. The real story behind the fussing about the blackface is how irrelevant and silly the NAACP is.
yeah.
That
I
they used to talk about desegregation. This was Dr. King. Dr. King had figured out that black problems are due to the fact that they went to school with other black children and they didn't go to school with white children. And then this is accepted today. He did this fantastic thing. He desegregated the schools, all this wonderful stuff. They passed the Fair Housing Act so blacks could buy houses. Well, the fact of the matter is that there has never been any study that showed that mixing the races in the schools had any significant impact on black academic performance on any kind of objective test. That King got his way, the New York Times got its way, the NAACP got its way, the Anti-Defamation League of B'nai B'rith got its way, and all over America, this was implemented, even in the North. White kids are put in buses and bus 20 or 30 miles so that the schools in Boston and Charlotte would have the right racial. Well, you never hear any of these people talking about a study quantifying the results of this. You hear about, thank God we made all that progress. It's just so wonderful. And they act like we're supposed to believe in the success of these programs without any scientific studies. Well, there have been studies, and they've all shown it's been a complete waste of time. It has utterly failed, as has fair housing. The Fair Housing Act was going to turn blacks into suburban homeowners. The rate of black homeownership today is lower than it was in 1965, when the Fair Housing Act was passed. Lower today. You know,
which is extraordinary considering all of the programs that exist just to get black people into homes
oh
to
yeah, well
be
they've had
first time home buyers.
special racist affirmative action, programs. They put up their down payments, they subsidize their mortgages, and all this stuff, and still the rate is lower. The civil rights movement be shown by objective scientific data to have failed utterly because it's based on nonsense. It's based on nonsense as nonsensical as the idea that one's gender is not determined by one's physical anatomy and the makeup of one's chromosomes. With the transgender thing, we're you know the, we're not to take note of the fact that the cerebellum sizes in the average African American's brain and the average European American's brain is 15% smaller in the average African, almost exactly the difference in IQ, because the cerebellum is where you do your thinking, and but we're not ever consider physical reality. You're not supposed to consider physical reality. You're supposed to be in this sort of ether world, this new agey world of feelings and optimism and all this stuff. So the NAACP has nothing better to do now. It's gotten its way on everything: the desegregation, mixing of the neighborhoods, busing. They've had everything their way. Everything they want has been done for them. And they're left now to go around whining about Confederate statues that,
Yeah.
oh, we're just emotionally wrecked. We just can't cope because there's a Confederate statue downtown. You couldn't make it up. White people should just be laughing at this. And
Well,
black people,
and that's
that
why the stories.
black people, of whom there are a lot of them, they should be embarrassed with this silly stuff.
Well, and that's why this story is so important to bring out, because again, it's the school colors, black. They're just making their entire bodies black. People do this all the time. I was watching. I'm embarrassed to say this, Sam, but I was watching one of your alma mater, University of Georgia, played University of Alabama this past weekend, and
Yeah,
they showed people in the stands and red paint
yeah,
from
painted themselves red and black.
face.
Red and black are flying above. Red and black are colors we love. Yeah. I mean, it's just ridiculous. But they,
Yeah,
but really, somebody coined the term for Jesse Jackson of poverty pimp,
they did.
and that's a very good term. The NAACP now is a poverty pimp organization. It's run by people who make money out of this problem that they've never been able to solve, and that none of their solutions are solving. It's sort of like the March of Dimes that started out against polio, but when polio was stopped, the people drawing in the big fat salaries, they didn't want to just say, "Well, we've accomplished our goal. Let's all go back home. I'm going back to my tire store in Dahlonega." They didn't do that. They took up another cause of birth defects, and so the civil rights industry now is reduced to these poverty pimps running around telling blacks that they're ruined because they walked by a Confederate statue, or they somebody put blackface on it at a high school football game. These people prove our point. They're beyond Jared Taylor. I mean, they're better instructors than Jared Taylor is about race. Just looking at this stuff, you would think sensible people would draw conclusions and just laugh at it.
Well, here's how the story ends. Fayette County Superintendent Dr. Jonathan Patterson said a non-Whitewater High School student is in the picture along with several adults. Quote, "We wanted to state it clearly, it is never acceptable to paint one's face black. The action is deeply offensive and it does not reflect the values of our schools and our community." I mean, again, it's the people that I saw that are students at UGA, they had their faces red, but I guess if they'd painted themselves black, I guess Athens would be embroiled in a blackface scandal now. But the superintendent went on to say they were quickly addressed by administrators when they entered, though the district regrets letting them in the first place. He apologized for the pain it caused. Moving forward, we're committed to ensuring this does not happen again. Local NAACP leaders want the district to discipline people in the picture and change the code of content to prevent this from happening again? I mean, do they want them? Is this a misdemeanor? Is this being banned from sports? Going to see their kids play sports? I mean, it's all pretty laughable. And I think the point, Sam, that why this is an important story. I saw this on social media, and white people were laughing about it. They're like, "This is just ridiculous. Why is this even a story?" And I think that's a very important thing, that the power of being accused of racism, that has to wane.
Well, white I don't understand white people. You know, as I've said before, the real problem we have is a white problem. You know, and blacks rioted nationwide. There were demonstrations around the world, but in America there were riots, predominantly blacks, but also, of course, egged on by the mentally ill Antifa. But but you know, white people. Where are the white riots in the wake of the killing of that Ukrainian woman on the bus in Charlotte? You know, whites never react. You know, and the establishment justifies black behavior. At heart, they don't believe blacks are equal. I remember when I was in high school, we had a series of black riots in '64 and '65, which was embarrassing to Lyndon Johnson and the administration as they were trying to pass all of these civil rights bills. And the media and the politicians all said that, oh, it's hot. That's why the riots were. It's hot. And the few handful of us at Druid Hills High School who thought independently would joke with each other. Gee, it's 85 degrees today. Guess we're going to have to go riot.
Was that in the Carter Commission?
But I mean, you know, it's just silly. They do this. You know, if a white guy is said to kill a black guy in Minneapolis in the George Floyd thing, well, that's a big thing. It's understandable blacks would riot. But if a black guy in Britain goes into a dance school and kills 3 little girls, like happened last August in Britain,
Yeah.
and there's some white riots, that's just terrible. You know, Keir Starmer went on television and made a statement, but that he was going to track everybody down, and they were going to go to jail and throw away the key and all this stuff. Well, you know, it just shows that at heart, our enemies also don't believe in equality.
Well, speaking of equality, Sam, there's a great story at Axios, which I think finally tells us what the whole concept of diversity means. Corporate boards hire white men at fastest rate in 8 years amid Trump's DEI purge.
Yeah.
So, do you remember back in 2011, 2012, Newsweek had a cover story called "The Beaching of the White Male" when it came to corporate America, and it was a
Mhm.
white guy on like the shoreline, face down, and it talked about how corporate America was doing everything possible to impede the advancement for, I guess, white guys in middle management up the corporate ladder. Does that ring a bell at all?
Yeah, I've heard about that. I don't remember the article in question, but we all know about DEI and the efforts to hire blacks and to a lesser extent women on the corporate boards.
Well, Business Week back in 2023, they published a story that showed that post George Floyd, the S&P 100 added more than 300,000 jobs, with 94% going to people of color, because they had basically said, we are here, we're our corporate America, we pledged over $200 billion to Black Lives Matter and these various type causes, and we promised to give you all of these jobs. And it was actually, this is crazy, it was almost 2 years ago this article was published, September 25th, 2023, where they promised, where they basically said, yeah, Bloomberg said 94% of these new jobs, these 300,000 jobs in the S&P 100 companies, went to people of color. And now here we are. We're what, 9 months into the Trump presidency, 2.0, and this year, white men have made up a majority of new directors at the S&P 500 companies for the first time since 2017, according to data from the research firm ISS Corporate. It's the latest stat illustrating how quickly, unsubstantially, Sam, the Trump administration has set back diversity goals over the last few years at corporations, schools, and the federal government. Has there ever been a more revealing line than that? White,
The
white.
whole point of it is that they believe that hiring should not be done according to ability, but that everyone should, everyone, every ethnic group and gender group is entitled to they're entitled to positions according to their numbers, and performance doesn't have anything to do with it. And I think behind that there is this naive, silly idea in the brains of addle-brained liberals that if you put somebody in a job, their IQ will go up, and then they'll be able to do the job. You take somebody and put them in the surgeon's room, doing the operation in the hospital. Well, he's going to become a real surgeon, and this is not it. And that's the point I've made that I think many of our people, many of our listeners, maybe don't grasp, and that is the real cost of affirmative action is not because the better qualified white boy doesn't get the job, but the lesser qualified black woman does. That isn't 1,000th of the problem, and I see this all the time in day-to-day life, and I think other people see it too, but they don't connect the dots. When you put somebody who can't do the job into a position, there are huge problems when he doesn't do the job. And we had two colossal water mains break within hours of each other in Atlanta a few months ago, and as a result, they had to turn the water off in half the city. Unfortunately, it was the South Atlanta, which is the black area. But the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, which you can always count on to lie, they claimed they did an in-depth investigation, and of course, the in-depth investigation airbrushed out all the racial things that had driven this, but they found that the city has always employed people to maintain the water, inspect the water mains, and to see that the valves and stuff are working. And but starting in 1973, from that day on, there are no filings of any reports of inspections by the people who draw checks to do the inspection. Now, they failed to mention that that was the year in which Maynard Jackson was elected mayor, and the whites were removed from the government and the government employment, and blacks were put in their stead. But it's that the effect of putting these incompetents there was that when the water mains broke, according to this investigation by the Journal Constitution, there were valves that you were supposed to be able to turn and cut off the water flow. But the water just gushed for days. I'm talking about pipes that are like 4 feet wide, just rivers of water running through downtown Atlanta from these breaks. And they found that the valves had rusted shut, and they could not be moved. So they were unable to cut off the water. That's the real cost of affirmative action. They had to send a special truck escorted by the state patrol racing to Birmingham, because Birmingham had some kind of piece of equipment that could make these rusted valves that had been allowed to rust shut turn.
Well, it's just as antiquated as Atlanta's system, probably.
Yeah,
So it's
I
still
mean,
the
it just
same.
goes, but you multiply that. I see this all the time dealing with government. It's just rife. And also with private business. You you see it all the time. And whites are just so cowardly. The odd thing about whites is their passivity. Now, in America, it's enough to make you believe the stuff that I read. I remember back in the 60s, there was all this stuff about fluoridation acts as a sedative and so forth. Something counts for it. The whites are so cowardly and so dumbed down.
But wasn't there a passivity before fluoridation, though? Which it's supposed
Yeah, they were already passive. The reactions are not normal. And I'm not urging criminality. And this is a dangerous thing to say, and I know Jared will be upset with me for saying it. But the guy that killed the black fellow over in Texas, who dragged him to death, I think his name was Byrd, Byrd, was the guy that
I believe
dragged.
that's correct.
I read an article about him in a newspaper in Florida, in Key West, that at that time was run by libertarians, and it would actually report things that other papers wouldn't. They interviewed they had a thing about the warden of the prison in which this white guy had been confined. He had to serve a 6-month prison sentence on a penny ante burglary charge. And probably the judge was looking to balance the jails to show that we're going to put whites in jail too. But he went to jail. And the lying media claimed that he joined an Aryan racist white gang in the jail. And that's not true. The warden said he had never joined, and the whites wouldn't have him because they felt he didn't fight hard enough on the first day when he was gang raped by 4 blacks in the shower. And he was raped daily for 6 months. And surprisingly enough, he came out of jail with a psychotic hatred of black people. And this stuff is going on all the time. Those outrageous things are happening, and I'm not condoning what the guy did. I'm sorry the black guy was dragged to death. I would never drag a black guy to death. I maybe I'm a pussy myself, but there's on the other side, this stuff is happening all the time, and the amazing thing is that there are not more of these people. The Waco thing, where the aftermath of Waco, where the Tim McVeigh guy shot up the government building in Oklahoma. I'm not condoning that either. But there were 100 and something people burned alive in that thing by this
In
out.
Waco
Yep,
crash. Yeah.
children were killed. Those children, many of them have siblings. They have grandparents. You would think there'd be hell to pay, but there's not. Whites are just it's the most remarkable thing about our society today is passivity. There's never been a more passive society. If this had been France, if these things like the Waco thing, or the sexual molestation of this guy in a Texas prison, or the guy in Alabama, if this had gone on in France in 1792, or 1785, the guillotines would have gone up much earlier. To get rid of a government that allowed such things. They would have been taking the nobility and the big landowners and the king to the guillotine years earlier. But in our society, there's just no reaction. But anyway,
Well, I think it's important to go back and just quickly go over the story from a few years ago because like I said, September 25th, 2023, Bloomberg reported that for a brief moment in 2020, much of corporate America united around a common goal to address the stark racial imbalances in their workplace. Protests sparked by the murder of George Floyd led to a flurry of corporate promises, both specific and vague, to hire and promote Black people and others from underrepresented groups. Exclusive analysis by Bloomberg News shows how many of those public companies did. The U.S. Equal Employment Opportunity Commission requires companies with 100 or more employees to report their workforce demographics every year. So here's what happened. 88% of those S&P 100 companies calculated overall U.S. job growth at those firms. In total, they increased their U.S. workforces by 323,000 people in 2021, the first year after the Black Lives Matter protest. Only 6% of those jobs went to white people, Sam. 94%.
and
It's
blacks would
people of
not
color.
and blacks would not have taken that lying down. But whites will. I
Well,
went I went to a bar association seminar one time in which it was on civil rights law, and the speaker explained what he called, I'm trying to think of it, the levels of scrutiny. And the Supreme Court and the federal courts have laid out rules on levels of scrutiny. And if there is a municipal policy or something that impacts groups in a different level, a disparate impact it's called, the highest level of scrutiny is if it hurts Black people. And then they went through the different levels of scrutiny, the gays, the women, the Hispanics, the Indians, and basically if it came down to the policy impacted straight white males, then you don't give a damn about it. And I looked around the room. Most of the guys, most of the people in the room were guys. Most of them were white guys, the heterosexual guys, and they were just sitting there writing all this down. You know, if they had been yeah, if you said the opposite, that, and by the way, if it affects black people, then we don't give a damn. They get the lowest scrutiny. Blacks would have been on their feet yelling about it and furious. But the white guys are all okay, all right, okay. I go to the back of the bus.
Well, look at the way Black Sam reacted to the potential Doge cuts by pointing out that it was federal, state, and local government jobs that created the artificial black middle class. The New York Times, the Washington Post, all published many stories about Prince George's County, Charles County, Maryland. They talked about an area of Atlanta. I remember reading an article about an area of Atlanta that was going to be hit hard, especially all of the ancillary industries that cater to the so-called black middle class, these government jobs. Uh, the hairstyle places where they spend, I think blacks spend 6 times the amount on their hair than white women do, because they have to buy the weaves, the products from India. And a lot of the people who do this for a living, A, they're already impacted by the potential tariffs, but B, their clients no longer having access to capital. One of the things we haven't talked about is I think over 100,000 people today resigned from the federal government because of the early retirement, Sam. And there's some fascinating things out there. There's so many stories you can read about the over reliance on government jobs for the creation of specifically black women who are employed within the federal, state, and local government, and rely upon that to, like I said, create this fictional, artificial, otherwise non-existent black middle class that is entirely dependent upon government jobs.
Yep, that's the way it is. And and government jobs are. I'm not a libertarian. I'm in favor of a very powerful government. Our problems will only be solved by extremely strong government. And I,
Agreed.
but the fact is that most people who work for government are not actually producing anything for us. They're not growing food. They're not building cars. They're not roofing houses. They're regulating and observing and moving papers around from one desk to another. So the rate of public housing and public employment in a lot of these cities is just off the charts. In Atlanta, they're just scads of these municipal jobs that we created. We we
Yeah,
we could I'd say we could fire half the people in the government in Atlanta, and it would not really affect government services at all.
it wouldn't affect it at all. No, you're exactly right. And just to put a bow on this conversation regarding the fact that Axios is reporting with the end of with the purging of DEI from all these corporations, you're basically seeing white guys being brought back for the first time. They're now the majority of new directors at S&P 500 companies for the first time since 2017. Again, Axios is basically saying diversity just means making less opportunities available for white males. It's really that simple. And you have
Well,
to,
I remember that there's a university over in Alabama called Auburn University, and I remember reading years ago they had forced the Kappa Alpha fraternity to take down the Confederate flag. Kappa Alpha has always been really in your face Southern, and they forced them to take down the Confederate flag, and they quoted the vice president of Auburn University saying that Auburn is committed to diversity, and we can't have diversity if we don't get rid of all this Southern stuff.
well, in the case of that university, in the case of the Kappa Alpha fraternity, and in the case of white males applying and hoping to climb that corporate ladder, up until this year, I mean, you're seeing, and I know you will end with this because I want you to have the last word, because you said something that's very important. You're not a libertarian. State power does matter, and I know you have a lot of reservations. We're not here to endorse any candidates. We're not here to endorse any party. However, this is all possible. These gains in the S&P 500 companies for white males now making up the majority of new directors because of what Trump has done to cut back and push back against
That's true.
diversity,
That's
equity,
true.
inclusion.
That is true, but we also have to understand that these things don't really matter. that we have not won. I'm astonished at how many people I meet that think that because Trump is president, we've won. We can all go back to watching football. No, we have not. Not a single chairmanship of any department of any university in America has changed hands. And these people that are getting these jobs, these white guys, I can tell you the kind of people they are. They're the get along, go along type, and they will sell out their race because they're completely individualistic. This is what I'm going to talk about at AMRAN, is the importance of group loyalty. Without loyalty, there can be no morality. Without loyalty, there can be no society. Loyalty is the concrete that holds the bricks of society together. And we don't have that in America. We don't have a loyalty. We're not even loyal to our families and parents. People talk with their parents, like this friend of mine blaming his father for staying at work and not coming to watch his soccer games. We don't have a community. And these guys, there may be one or two of them. There are a few. I've known a few, and they're fine. But by and large, these are going to be people who will be very happy to be celebrating Black History Month and implementing all the enemy propaganda. We want to end on something positive, though. There are conclusions to be drawn from all of this. And the conclusion for the white guys listening to this, and white women too, is there is no future for a white nationalist or an aware white person who intends to be a free person, able to express his opinions and act independently. There is no future in business. There's no future in big business. And
Corporate America. Yeah.
you have to have assets that you truly own. You have to be independently employed to be free. And you've got to have your own. I left a big firm when I was 27 years old and went out on my own. There were a lot of political reasons for that, but also a practical financial reason. That was, I found out the pension and profit sharing plan was basically unfunded. All the money that we paid in was being paid out to the old guys who had founded the thing and who had set up the pension and profit sharing plan so that they would benefit. And I knew full well that when I got to be 65 years old, there wouldn't be any firm of that name because of the young lawyers would simply pack up their desk and move to the bank building across the street, and there'd be a new firm name, and there was nothing there. It was like a jet engine. The oxygen came in one side, the carbon dioxide came out the other, and I knew that even though it would be hard, that I had to have independently owned assets. And that's what everybody listening to this broadcast needs to understand. You have to plan your finances. You have to plan your business. You have to find a way to support yourself independently from big business.
Wow, that's profound words from Mr. Sam Dixon, who we were once again honored to have him step in for Mr. Taylor. I believe Sam will be joining us again early next week. We're going to record this early in the week, guys, just to get it up, so that you are just delightful listener who make this all possible can have some fun with the podcast, and we want to hear from you so we can get some thoughts, criticisms, or stories you want us to talk about. You can shoot me an email at becausewelivhere@protonmail.com. Once again, that's becausewelivhere@protonmail.com, or you can go to the contact tab at amrin.com, and you can inquire about the upcoming conference in November. Seats are running out, so you definitely do want to take advantage of being able to meet people like Kevin Deanna, like Jared Taylor, like Sam Dixon, and the other speakers who will be there. But if you have any ideas that you'd like us to talk about next week, email there at the Contact Us tab. So, Sam, any other final thoughts, or are you good?
Well, the final thought would be that we have to be happy warriors. And there are a lot of people that go around with long faces about what we suffer, and we do suffer. I've suffered a lot in life, but I also have had a rich life, and we live life to the fullest. We have a people that we can connect to. We are loyal. We have a team, and we have full lives. Cicero is our friend. Shakespeare is our friend. We don't live these empty lives that the so-called normies live and the conformists live. And we're better off for it. We have happy, full lives. So be happy. There's strength through joy.
Strength through joy. Vic, there, I like that. Strength through joy. So until next week, ladies and gentlemen, we thank you so much for joining us, and we look forward to speaking to you next week.